From the United Kingdom comes a new movement, actually, a new climate campaign, certainly, which is called Our Fair Future. And it focuses on not so much on climate, but on economic well being of ordinary people with clean air and energy and better health for all and that kind of thing. And Joseph Gelfer, who is a sustainability strategist and a clean jobs advocate, I think you have a big stake in this organization. Is that right, Joseph?
Well, certainly we've been having a lot of conversations around this organisation. It started out, last year, big abstract conversations around what we were describing as climate populism. And we were really trying to talk about, okay, these are some nice ideas, almost academic in nature, but, how do we take those types of ideas into the real world? And that's kind of like in that process of translating those abstract ideas into something tangible. That's where Our Fair Future comes from. So it's really trying to break out of the standard climate conversation, reach a completely different type of people who are currently disengaged for one reason or another, or maybe even outright triggered by various climate conversations. So really, I guess like a democratizing type of discussion.
And talking then about economy?
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned this phrase climate populism at the beginning, but the paradoxical thing is that Our Fair Future doesn't have climate up in the top level. So the idea is, like, by all means, if you look at around globally, there's a new project that says that 89% of people globally are worried about climate. So that's a fact. The problem with that reasoning, that thinking, okay, loads of people are worried about climate, therefore we're going to get loads of climate action, is that it's not really true. Because while 89% of people are worried about climate, they're more worried about other things. So whatever survey and whatever country you look at, number one, typically cost of living. Underneath that, you've got things like health, housing, education, crime, law and order, those types of things. Climate, anywhere between 6, 10, 12 on that list. People certainly aren't voting on it. So the idea that somehow you're going to be able to capitalise upon all of that concern for climate just isn't true. So we're really about leaning into the things that people care about most. Cost of living being number one. We've got energy, we've got nature, which is another really big unifying subject across the political divide. And we've got health, which again, everybody cares about. And then you bring in climate as like a co-benefit, as a horizontal across all of those things.
And then what's going to come out of it in the other end? I mean, yes, I agree with you. This sounds like exactly how it is in my community anyway. I can, when I talk with my neighbors and so on. But then what do you do to actually get climate action out of it without using the word?
Yeah, well, we got kind of what we're describing as a three-part theory of change of turn on, team up, and take over. So at the moment, we're in that first phase of turn on, which is really just about building awareness around the ideas, which is pretty much what standard climate campaigning does, right? You do an information exchange, you give people some knowledge, and you hope that they think differently about it. But one thing that we know from previous, well, the whole of the history of the climate movement, is that giving people information and hoping that they're going to live differently and make different choices as a result doesn't really work. So that's where we get into kind of like part two of team up. So that's where we're taking those ideas that we've developed and we're starting to translate them into real life. So, in the pubs, in the churches, on the housing estates, on the gardening allotments, on the football clubs, all of the places where people are at, where they're in real life and starting to bring people together to think about this stuff, to start doing things together, developing a bit of agency, developing trust between one another, right? Because there's so much discord, so much fracturing in society. And that doesn't do the us any favours. Maybe we'll talk a little bit later about who us is.
Let's talk about that right now, Joseph, because I think a big change that there has been in the last year in the climate movement is that there is now Trump in the US and there is the Reform political party in the UK. And we have various players in Australia as well who are all saying climate is a big scam, or they're saying we certainly don't want these new transmission towers built or wind turbines. Wind turbines are bad for the environment, and so on. So there is a polarization at the moment between those who want a green transition and then others who are like really aggressively opposing it.
For sure, for sure. So look, one of the failings of the climate movement over the decades is it's been quite an exclusive environment. You kind of have these people who believe that they're right, and for the most part, they are right. They're right on climate and the environment and all of that stuff. But they got a bad habit of demonizing other people. We remember the classic thing of Hillary Clinton when she was campaigning, describing the basket of deplorables. Right? There's this a palpable disdain amongst a lot of these kind of middle class environmental campaigners. So they go out there, they look at Trump voters in the US, they look at Reform voters in the UK, they assume that they're all kind of racists, far right extremists, that they need to be defeated and, just somehow taken away from, even like the whole public domain. You're getting people kind of being deplatformed, being cancelled. You're not allowed to say this, you're not allowed to say that. None of that works. And I think so. One of the really uncomfortable things that a lot of progressives need to kind of figure out first is just how much they are alienating those people, how much they are misrepresenting them. Of course, there are some racists and nasty people in those movements, but most of them just are not. Most of them are regular folks trying to get by, and they're clutching for straws. And the people that should be looking after them are not looking after them. They're just being misrepresented and being described as a bunch of racists. So it's not good enough. So in our fair future, we've only really got two groups of people. We've got the polluters, they're the enemy, and we're being very clear about who the enemy is. And then we've got the rest of us. So we can think about this as like the occupied, the 99%. So if the rest of us are the 99%, that's got to be really diverse. It's like you've got to... people talk about diversity, but that's actually quite a limited way that people are thinking about it. Now, here we've got to be like super diverse. And the challenge of that, and here's where the real challenge for most progressive people is it means that you've got to be around the table with people you probably don't like, that you disagree with. There have got to be things that, okay, I don't like your take on immigration. I don't like your take on economics. I don't like your take on culture. We've got to find a way of putting that on the back burner for a while, and by a while I mean like 50 years, something like that, and actually come together as the 99% on those things that we care about most: fairness, a future for the planet, right? And push that agenda and fight against the polluters together. That's the way that we do it, and no one's really doing that. People are talking about it. They're talking about it from World Economic Forum in Davos. Why does everybody hate us? We should do something about it. They're talking about it in little meetings at Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and everybody in between, but not many people are actually doing it because it's hard. It's really uncomfortable. That's what Our Future is about.
Well, there is also a power structure in this, and the so-called state capture, which has been described very well, I think, by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse in America, who gave his 300th speech, and we've been mentioning it in Sustainable Hour recently, where he talks about, for instance, that there is actually a flow of money from government to the fossil fuel industry of billions of dollars. Just in America, it's $700 billion a year that is subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. And then, for instance, to pay 1% of that back as dark money going from the fossil fuel industry back to into politics is not very much. It's a 1% investment in that you keep things as they are, or that you make sure that the laws are benefiting the fossil fuel industry and not, the green transition. And we see very similar patterns, I would say, in Australia, where there's a large gas and coal industry, and money is flowing quietly into politics, either legally or as dark money. And I think that structure is very, very difficult, you could say, for the climate movement to find a way to approach and to change.
It's difficult, and one of the reasons that people are finding it difficult to respond to is because they're not actually thinking big enough, I would argue. So everything you're saying, absolutely right. Jane Meyer's book, Dark Money, from like a decade ago was fantastic at starting to bring form to all of that type of networking. So ultimately, you've got a bunch of corrupt politicians. I've got no interest in the Democrats or the Republicans or Labour or the Conservatives. It's all much of a muchness. I'm pretty on board with the idea of two wings of the uni party. They're never going to change. The time for influence is finished. There's no time for to reform this system. It's utterly corrupt. It's got to go. You need a completely revolutionary type of thinking. And I don't say that in any naive way. I mean, if you look at Trump in the US, you look at Farage in the UK, they're actually quite revolutionary. Indeed, in a press conference just a few weeks ago, Farage was talking about revolutionary politics. He actually used that word. What politician would say that anymore? Farage does. This is a revolutionary moment. So the thing about climate is it's got to think much bigger. Forget about trying to influence power. You take power. That's the answer. Now, of course, the mechanics of how you go about doing that are all open for debate, and there's different ways of doing it, right? But ultimately, if you're constantly titting around, doing petitions, sitting in streets, demanding change, hey, politicians, they've got no interest in people demanding change. You have to take power and enforce change. You do what Trump did, right? You get into power, whatever it takes, as Malcolm X said, by any means necessary, and you flood the zone with climate policies, with nature policies, with economic fairness policies, and the opposition just cannot even keep up. They don't know what's going on. But you do it because you're doing it for the 99% and they're going to love it.
What's your vision? What does that positive development look like, step by step?
I think there's a couple of different ways that it could work. So, there are some people who, in both the US and the UK, and probably in Australia and other countries as well, who are starting to pay some kind of lip service to the types of things that we're talking about right now. But it doesn't feel particularly genuine. It feels a bit like cosplay. It feels unlikely to me that they're going to pull it off, but maybe they will pull it off, and we'll get some kind of evolution of these types of traditional political parties. I think what reform shows in the UK is that you're probably not going to get significant change through those traditional parties, and that you need something new. So my expectation is that within the next 5 years, we'll start seeing the emergence of new political movements that don't exist today, but could easily win the election, if not in the next one in the UK in 29, certainly in 2034. Or if you were in the US to 2032 or whenever that election is going to be. That's probably the kind of time frame that we're looking at. It's going to be unprecedented, and people around, all of the political pundits are going to be shocked. It's not shocking, it's completely predictable. It's going to change, everything's going to change at mind-boggling pace. Climate's going to do it, and the response to climate's going to do it. It's inevitable. The only thing that's up for question is how it's going to change. And there, I think, the responsibility for those of us who have got our mind in the right space really comes to the fore. Because if we, as people who are mindful, hopefully with integrity, right, and good intentions for the future, if we do not take control of this quite chaotic energy that's starting to emerge and guide it in the right direction, the bad guys will. And we don't want that.
I think that's what people really already have felt. And there's a lot of apathy and fear. And the fear often means that people stop doing anything active. They go out in their backyards and take care of planting some tomatoes.
There's no choice but fear, right? We've got two options. And they're both fear. They're both scary, right? You've got the option of putting up with the status quo, which is scary. Maybe there's three options. One, you put up with the status quo. It's scary. You pretty much end up dead. Number two, you kind of invest all of your energy into influencing power and trying to reform an incremental change. That's probably not going to work either. I mean, most progressive people have been trying to do that for the past 20 or 30 years. So that's also a very scary choice. And then you've got the third choice, the kind of stuff that we're talking about right now, which is this explosive revolutionary change, which is also terrifyingly scary, but there is a possibility that it's going to work. All the evidence suggests that those other two options lead you off the cliff. So this is the paradox, I think, of the types of stuff that we're talking about, this kind of revolutionary change, is that while it ostensibly appears scary, if you think rationally about it, it's actually the safer choice, because it's the only one that takes any proportionate response on this kind of planetary crisis. So when you think in a slightly bigger frame, it becomes the sensible way forward.
So let's talk about language, because, for instance, I've run a series of podcast episodes that I call the climate revolution, actually. But climate, maybe not so smart to talk about climate anymore. Maybe we need to move that discussion into, like you're saying, cost of living and other aspects. And revolution, maybe also not the best word if you are going out to campaign. So how do we deal with the language? Even if what we want to create is a climate revolution, we don't want to use the word, do we?
Well, as I say, Farage is using the word revolution right now. I mean, I think we need to, let's break up the idea of revolution and climate as kind of language groups for a moment. So we're at a particular moment in time, right? So politically, so the political zeitgeist is revolutionary. Trump got in to deliver revolution. Farage, who I'd imagine will win in 29, if you look at the polls today, he would win, is going to get in. So this is about disruption. People want disruption. They are so exhausted by the political status quo in most countries that they're actually willing to have a punt on the craziest of ideas just to get something different. People absolutely want to break the system. So I think actually revolution is a reasonable word to use. Actually, if we'd have had this conversation 10 years ago, I would have said, oh, don't use that word, that's nuts. Today, I actually think it's probably the right word to use. But if we go into climate, for sure. So, climate's quite, it's a politically charged word, as is net zero, right? So, and you get stuck into this issue around, whether or not climate is real. And then you get stuck in so there's a whole bunch of conversations that you don't want to get stuck in, right? So if we start talking about other issues, I mean, and also, you have to assume that someone knows something about climate science and carbon emissions and all of that stuff. People have a loose understanding about it, but it's difficult. That's where other words are easier. Words like pollution, for example. Pollution is fantastic. So if kind of think of like a blanket of pollution that's around the world, we all know that when you sit under a blanket, you get hot. So of course, that's global warming for you right there. Now, pollution does not tell the whole story. I get that. Scientifically, it's not the whole story, but it's intuitive. People understand it. And then you can point to the polluters and say, all right, well, they're the guys that are actually doing it. Maybe you know this. How many people do you think die every year from the pollution caused by fossil fuel emissions?
Well, it's millions. I think the figure is like 8 million people.
Yeah. Depends which study you look at, somewhere between 5 and 8 million. That is a holocaust. I don't use this word lightly. That is a literal holocaust every single year caused by the polluters. That's it. You don't need any more. Lock them up. What another thing we're getting about at the moment about let's criminalize disinformation so that these people can't do greenwashing. What? Why are we talking about disinformation? They're serial killers. They're genocidal maniacs. Lock them up. Everybody gets it. You kill 5 million people a year, you spend the rest of your life in prison. Simple as that. You put enough of them away, it stops. I mean, I know that's not simplistic. That's simple. And it's common sense and everybody gets it. But what we don't have right now is a conversation where people are hearing that type of message from credible sources. It sounds like the kind of crazy shit you'd hear down the pub, right? But it's actually exactly what people want to hear. So part of Our Fair Future is also about that. It's just stating the obvious. What everybody understands, what most people actually agree with. You kill millions of people, you go to prison for the rest of your life. That will change things radically. That's not giving someone a $20 million fine that they've probably already got a line on the budget for, and then they carry on with their job. That's the way that the high-ups and the elites typically get criminalized, right? And there's loads of them, loads of examples of that type of thing happening. You put the executives into prison. How many would it take? I mean, it's an interesting exercise, right? How many polluters would, so maybe one polluter to get some media headlines, 100 polluters to make governments start getting scared, 1,000 polluters sent away for life. You change the global system.
Joseph, I'm thinking, who's going to take this globally? Do we need a Greta Thunberg to speak for us, or is it going to be you?
Not going to be me. I mean, I'm just speaking what feels like common sense, right? I think one of the interesting things about this is that it's going to look different in different countries. So I like it. Sounds a bit academic, but I like to describe this as like a vernacular. There are certain kind of horizontal themes that land globally, but the conversation is going to look different in different places. So if you are a relatively small democracy like the United Kingdom, or even smaller, like your home country, it's going to have particular characteristics. You're going to work probably within the standard democratic system. You have a policy platform, you campaign on it, you convince people why it's the truth, blah blah blah. If you look somewhere like China, it's completely different, right? So that China and I think China are an extremely interesting place to look to for how this kind of stuff might unfold, because China has this unique political culture where you could roll, if they were inclined, you could roll these kind of policies out quite differently. So right now, China are trying to establish some kind of maybe not global hegemony through economics, but getting their seat at the table that they rightly deserve because they're a billion people, through the standard mechanics of macroeconomics. But that's like old paradigm thinking, right? So if they were then to look forward into the new paradigm, you wouldn't be seeking economic hegemony, you'd be seeking ecological hegemony. And you would say, all right, we're going to impose these types of policies. And if you want to engage with us, you're going to have to start getting on board. We're going to roll it out in our country. And then we're going to start rolling it out with our partners globally. So those, whether or not you were a small country like Denmark or a huge country like China, you could have these kind of like similar endpoint objectives, but the way that you would roll it out would probably look quite differently. So from a small country, I could imagine like a domino effect, where if it happened in Denmark, then you could imagine it happening in other small states. Maybe it then hops over to New Zealand, for example. If China were doing it, it would be a completely different dynamic, and maybe there would be other kind of middle points. So I don't think there's like this singular global solution, rather these different regional expressions of similar ideas.
Similar thinking, and also maybe the ideas about language. So take me through a little bit of your vocabulary. What should we be talking about then, if not climate?
Yeah, so no one likes climate. We've talked a little bit about pollution. I think it's really about what are the themes that people are interested in. So, for example, in New York, we've recently had the Zohran Mamdani win for the Democratic primaries, and the word that he used was affordability. So in New York, affordability seemed to be a fantastic word to use. Does that work for everybody? I don't know, but it was a really good example of somebody that hit upon a word that just resonated with people. So there are various universal themes that people are interested in. Everyone's interested in what I've been calling cost of living. He's, with a little bit more grace, is calling affordability. Everyone's interested in energy. That is, there are various things. They want clean energy. They really want energy sovereignty, so they're not stuck in these dangerous geopolitical, relationships with people. And most people want clean energy, right? Again, that's pretty broad across the political spectrum. Cost of living, energy, nature. Everybody loves nature. I remember like a year or so ago, I was at the big nature march here in London. It was orders of magnitude bigger than any climate march I had ever seen. And there were people, a whole spectrum. There was like crazy hunt saboteurs in the mix at the most militant end. And then there's like the National Trust and English Heritage and RSPB in the mix, right? These really large, quite conservative organisations, and everybody in between. So everybody loves nature. That's a good one. And then probably health. We've already talked a little bit about all of the health, well, the death that comes from air pollution, right? But there's loads of things: air pollution, microplastics, forever chemicals, all plus standard kind of heat deaths that are coming, water, purification problems. Everyone's interested in health. So those are like the four pillars really of our fair future: economic well-being, energy, nature, health. And then you kind of bringing in climate as a co-benefit that cuts across those four pillars.
So what's the next step for someone like me who really want to be part of this and maybe, do what I can at my end in Australia?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can imagine something like Our Fair Future working globally, again, with those regional, it's kind of with that regional vernacular, with that regional expression. So, Extinction Rebellion did a pretty good job of being an international movement. I guess having, first of all, you've actually got to break open a space to make it happen. So, I've spent the past couple of years trying to push people quite hard to have more honest conversations about what is and is not happening. I work in the corporate sustainability space. I have, the mixed blessing of engaging with a lot of very senior people in the climate and sustainability world. And for a long time, this was just about making a safe space for honest conversations. Because a lot of these people are, they have that kind of orthodox message in the public domain where we should support big businesses to transition into blah, blah, blah. We're going to have this small steps. They go to COP and they celebrate the nothing that happens at COP. But when you get them in private, if you can create that safe space and then kind of do a bit of, I'll show you mine if you show me yours kind of stuff, people start having a bit of a different opinion. There's no one gets into. So let's say, for argument's sake, that you're 50 or 60 years old and you're a chief sustainability officer at some, Fortune 500 company. I'm quite certain that the majority of those people did not get into the sustainability space to be greenwashers. They did not get into the sustainability space to be apologists for the status quo. They got into the sustainability space to make radical change. That's at heart who they are. And then along the way, they get co-opted, they hit the roadblocks, they become disillusioned, they become practical, and then they end up being, cogs in the machine. But in their hearts, there is this revolutionary spirit. There is a spirit of wanting to make the world a better place. And I think we just kind of need to start unlocking that and untapping it. And, and the other kind of, this is what I'd term like appealing to people's personal issues, is most people, again, if you're a bit older, and that's where the power, I'm focusing on slightly older people because that's where the power lies, right? They've got professional capital, political capital, maybe even a bit of financial capital. Is a lot of those people have kind of resigned themselves to not being the people that they thought they were going to be. They had a kind of a vision for themselves when they were 25. That vision slowly started ebbing away over the decades. And then typically, in their kind of mid to late 40s, they hit that trough of disillusionment. They realized that actually I didn't have the life that I thought I was going to have. And that's dark. It's not a nice place to be. But here's the beauty of this. Here's the silver lining. If you take something like Our Fair Future, it doesn't have to be Our Fair Future, this kind of vague range of ideas. You get this incredible second bite at the cherry. You can actually be that person again, and you can deliver on what you thought your life was going to be about. It's almost like, delivering on unfulfilled destiny. How many times in life do you get the chance to do that, to have a second go? And this, I think, is what this particular moment in time is about. And again, 5 or 10 years ago, it was a different conversation. Right now, it's at this inflection point where there is an opportunity to do extraordinary things if those people who have the ability to embody that extraordinary energy take it and capitalize upon it. That I think is an interesting moment. And that's why ultimately I'm feeling more optimistic today than for years. And it's purely because of the chaotic moment that we're in. Because while that chaos is horrifying and terrifying, there is opportunity in it. And the bad guys, they know that. That's why you kind of got that whole blood on the streets philosophy of business and investing and all of that kind of stuff. Like Rees Mogg's Sovereign Individual book and all of that. They know what opportunities lie in these moments in history. But for the most part, the good guys don't. But we can capitalize upon this.
That's right. I mean, we've almost moved from believing in peace to that the world is now in war, in a state of war, and certainly mentally.
I'd go further than mentally. I think we're pretty much fully in a hot war. I mean, if we go back to those 5 million people a year who are dying, and that's just on air pollution, doesn't even get into all of the rest of the stuff, and it certainly doesn't get into the future. That's just today. I think we're in a hot war, and people don't even realize it. And here I think, it's interesting to look back on what happened the last time that we were in a hot, for many of us in the kind of in the West, where we had that kind of aggression on our doorstep. So for most countries, that was probably like World War II. What did people do in World War II? They didn't sit around sending petitions to Hitler. You know, they fought to the death. And I don't want to say that lightly. We've all got family members who did that. Men and women across the nation who fought to the death because they were in an existential crisis and they believed it was the right thing to do. That I don't think it's too dramatic to say we're at that point, but people don't even realize it. And that's where when you get in that mindset, the responses that are open to you change radically. So the idea that somehow all you can do is try and improve your business or write another policy report, or worry about whether or not you're going to get the sack because you say something a bit too edgy on LinkedIn, that is completely irrelevant. And the risk management that is required, the risk assessment that is required when you're thinking in that hot war mentality, everything changes. And that, I think, is like a mindset shift that people need to get into. It's certainly coming. It would be better if it comes sooner rather than later, because the sooner it comes, the more managed the process is. The later it is, the more chaotic it becomes.
It sounds to me like that the business world could play a huge role in this, because a lot of the initiative and innovation and a lot of the good thinkers in the world actually go into business and make changes, but not in this field that you are talking about. What do you see in terms of the opportunities of working with business on this and actually pushing like a business revolution forward?
Yeah, well, it requires another mindset shift around responsibility, because at the moment, unfortunately, too many people in business, unpack the responsibility of change to government. So they're saying, we would like to produce more electric cars by 2030. Unfortunately, the policy environment is not stable enough. If the government can get it together to create better policies, we'll be more comfortable investing in electric cars, for example. But we know that, the governments are useless. They're a bunch of cronies in the pockets of the polluters. So that's lost. So it's not good enough to wait for policy. It's not good enough to wait for laws, especially as whether or not you're in the US or in the EU or in the UK, all of the laws are getting diluted on a daily basis. So that's a catastrophe. So the issue for businesses right now and in over the next days and years, decade or so, is they've got to take a completely different type of responsibility. They have to completely reimagine the way, transformation, disruption are words that are doled through repetition in business circles, right? I mean, so I hesitate to even use those words because they've become meaningless. But it is mind-boggling change, historically unprecedented change, that is what is required. It needs a completely different understanding of who the stakeholders in business actually are, who you're in service to, and the phrase I like to use is in service to life on earth. If you're not in service to life on earth, you don't deserve to be in business. And I'll tell you something right now, when something like Our Fair Future starts taking power, you will no longer have a license to operate. there is no future for the positive development of our planet where bad businesses are going to be allowed to operate. You're going to be put out of business. And if you resist, you're going to prison. It's going to be as simple as that. It's going to be pretty blunt. So the issue for businesses now is, and this is a standard business, case for sustainability, but it's always been performative, right? If you don't change within the next 5 years, you're probably going to end up in prison. And I'm not talking about going out of business, because going out of business is quite gentle. I'm not talking about consumer pressure. I'm talking about the hard edge of legal ramification. Right? So, and businesses can do that. And maybe this is actually we kind of bring back into other problems of like the climate movement. Is it inherently ends up being we need an end to capitalism. All right, I would like a world where there's no capitalism. I could imagine a world where that happens, but I also think it's probably going to take us about 200 years to get there, even if everybody was on board, right? So we need to work loosely within the economy that we've got. We can change values to assets. We could put nature up, we could put oil down, that type of stuff. But the infrastructure of the economy is loosely going to stay the same for quite a while. So business absolutely has a major part to play with this, but they've got to change who they're serving. In service to life on earth, to regular people, to animals, to trees, to water, to air, all of that type of stuff. That's where legacy is built. That's how you make the change. Businesses that do that today, in 100 years' time, people will be singing songs about them. Now, if you want a legacy, that's how you do it. It's like maybe you could it's a legacy that lasts for thousands of years, right? So just for like the personal egocentric nature of it, why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you want to be a hero that lasts in history?
We do have examples of that, like Patagonia.
That is, it's the classic example, right? And it's a good one, but there's not many of them. There are not. I actually struggle to think of a business that operates at scale other than Patagonia. I mean, and even they've got loads of problems, right? But they are going in the right direction and have actually taken some unprecedented steps to try and be bigger. And I think they're doing it in good faith, and I'm grateful to them. But I genuinely struggle to think of any other business that's kind of thinking at the appropriate scale about actually how they could exist in harmony on this planet. And that's actually quite mind-boggling when we think about how long we've been, the decades that we've been having this conversation now, not just about sustainability in general, but about sustainable business. What used to be, CSR, for those who are old enough to remember it, it's gone through various waves of nomenclature around it. But we've been having this conversation for decades, but almost no large business does it. And, there's some small businesses doing it, but their impact is negligible. It's got to be those massive businesses that do it. And they're not going to last long unless they do. They will be put out of business. And again, not through kind of consumer pressure, but through legal pressure, and probably sooner than they imagine.
What is your quest? I seek the Grail.
Initially, I imagined Our Fair Future as an ideas platform that would exist globally. That was before I kind of assumed that you actually need to take power. And then because you need to take power, it needs to work at the national level because that's how it's organised. So Our Fair Future, for the moment, is a UK organisation. But I've had conversations with people in Sweden, had conversations with people in the US. I could easily imagine Our Fair Future Australia, Our Fair Future USA, for sure. It needs... I've got ourfairfuture.com for somebody already. It needs people to drive it. So there needs to be that kind of general belief in the principles of it and the overall direction of travel and strategy, with that overlay of regional specificity, and with the ability to drive it forward with all of the strategic thinking that takes. I think there's a lot of benefit for international versions of Our Fair Future. There's pros and cons. The pro would be the branding is already in place, the thinking is already in place. You just go and kind of do it with local content. So it's relatively easy to get going. The downside is I can't think of a precedent where an international party in power replicates through to other countries. But maybe that's not a problem. Maybe this is because we're in this unprecedented moment, maybe that's what you get. I think it's up for debate.
Joseph Gelfer, I think, with all the ambitions that you have, we need to know who you are and where you're coming from. How did you get to this level of ambition that you're presenting to us today?
I think really it's just about intellectual honesty. I'm 51 years old. I've been around for a long time. I grew up as like a classic leftist, traveled through the world trying to survive with values in a world that does not really reward having values. I find myself these days working in the corporate sustainability space, a double-edged sword of seeing some amazing people trying to affect change, but on the other hand, seeing people not managing to affect change. And it's really okay. And I think also just having a general interest in politics, right? What's actually happening in this world. And the other stream there of being largely from a working class background, having a better understanding about what, the mythical ordinary people, how they feel and how they respond about things. So these are kind of like different streams that have kind of fed into this river. And then, again, the intellectual honesty. How do we bring about change? Everything has failed. And that's a painful thing to have to hear, right? The only, maybe it's simplistic. The only thing that I'm looking at are carbon emissions. And it's going up, 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 up every single year. Now, you could have some arguments, and a lot of people at fancy conferences will give you arguments. Oh, if we hadn't done this, that, and the other, it would have been even worse. Okay. I don't find that a particularly compelling argument. I need that graph to be going down precipitously. So, given that everything's failed, why did it fail? It failed because it seeks to influence power. And power has no interest in being influenced. So the ultimate distinction I always make between climate activism and climate populism is that climate activism seeks to influence power and climate populism seeks to take power. It's honest. And when people have a think about it and get over the initial shock of what that implies, my experience has been one of relief, because they know that all of the existing theories of change are broken. Well, they never worked at all. They know that they need something else, but no one has given voice to what that something else actually is. I mean, and it's not like it's new. You take power. I mean, it's classic political stuff, right? But we have become so depoliticized by design, by the system, right? We have become so defanged to the point where people look at somebody like Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and think that they're radical, which is utterly absurd because it's a bunch of pensioners sat holding bits of cardboard. The idea that that's radical is just ridiculous, but it just goes to show how our very imagination of what radical looks like has been completely closed off by design, by the system. So we just need to recapture possibility, a bit of agency, a bit of understanding about what could actually happen, and then start looking around to some of the examples of how it's already happening, but in different ways. People like Trump, people like Farage. Philosopher Zizek has this nice phrase that I like to use of the right steps in the wrong direction. And that's what we got with people like Trump and Farage right now. They're taking the right steps, but they're going in the wrong direction. We just need to course correct. Take all of the things that they're doing, course correct it, put it in service to life on Earth, and we're good to go. We can change this around. I expect to see the course correction within my lifetime. We're not going to fix it, but we can course correct. That's the timeline that I'm thinking on. And then just imagine what then happens to those people who then grow up. So I've asked progressives to do some painful things in this conversation. I've asked them to put issues that they care about onto the back burner while we then come together on these important things. Here's the good news. Once we've come together on those important things and we've course corrected it, my expectation would be that young people start growing up and they're saying, well, hold on a minute. Why aren't we dealing about that racial tension over there? Why aren't we dealing about this malnutrition in that country or any number of other injustices? And now all of these global problems, which today have no precedent for us being able to fix them, now we have a precedent. We came together on climate and nature, and we fixed it as a global problem. Now we can come together, we've got a precedent for all sorts of other issues, which in my mind makes like the next century look really quite phenomenal. For the first time in human history, you have an example in place. I mean, this sounds a bit new age, but take it seriously. For the first time in human history, you've got an example in place of global cooperation, coming together to do something for the collective good. It's never happened before in the history of humanity. It's probably going to happen in the next 30 years. That's special, right? That makes me feel good about the future. So I see lots of good things. This will ultimately, I think, be the legacy of the climate crisis for humanity. It's going to be lots of really horrific things that are going to come down the pipeline because of climate, right? But that legacy, the silver lining to the climate crisis, will be coming together for that precedent in global cooperation that will enable us to do other things. And I think in a long enough timeline, people will see it as a really positive moment in human history.
The Sustainable Hour.
For a green, clean, sustainable Geelong. The Sustainable Hour.